Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, based on where you're joining us from. It is 2 p.m. in New York, and let's give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join before we start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Banyan Impact Fellowship for Service in India information session. We are delighted that you could join us today. My name is Hari, and I'm the program manager for the Banyan Impact Fellowship. I also have with me our 2024 Banyan Impact Fellowship alumni, Ben. Welcome, Ben. In a short while, we will hear more about Ben's fellowship experience. Before we get started, a little bit about the structure of the information session. I will start with the presentation for about 10 minutes, talking about the fellowship program and the application process. Following that, our fellowship alumni, Ben, will talk about his fellowship experience, and then we will conclude the session with a question and answer. So I encourage everyone on the call to post their questions in the comment section, and we will get to the questions during the question and answer segment. Banyan Impact Fellowship is American India Foundation's oldest program. It started in 2001 and was formerly known as the William J. Clinton Fellowship for Service in India. American India Foundation is committed to improving the lives of underprivileged, especially women, children, and youth. The Banyan Impact Fellowship is a binational volunteer service program in the US India corridor with the mission to building a lasting bridge between the US and the India. The fellows, part of the first cohort, worked on disaster relief, but over the past 24 years, we've had more than 573 fellows work across 255 partner organizations on various projects closely linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The fellowship is a 10-month in-person volunteer service program in India between September and June. The program brings together both Indians and Americans to foster meaningful connections. The shortlisted fellows are mapped with grassroots NGOs in the development sector in India to accelerate impact. Fellows, along with host organizations, define project scope for the fellowship to serve the communities on ground. The thematic areas of the project that the fellows work on have expanded from disaster relief in 2001 to different areas to include education, public health, livelihoods, climate justice and environment protection, minority rights, so on and so forth. Here's a list of some of the benefits part of the fellowship program. As part of the fellowship program, all the fellows receive a living stipend. They also get a complete reimbursement of the visa and travel expenses incurred. This is a this is a return ticket to and fro from your home to your placement location. You also receive a full coverage health insurance and mental health support in the form of counseling. There is language training provided during the fellowship. There are also mentoring programs. So mentors are senior fellows who are veterans in their respective thematic areas that work with you through the duration of the fellowship in mentoring you. There is ongoing professional development beyond the orientation that happens throughout the year. You also have a program manager or a program officer working with you through the duration of the fellowship. You get multiple networking and career opportunities given we have 570 plus alumni. You get multiple opportunities to interact with them, be it workshops, coffee chats, etc. There is also the Virtual Leadership Institute, hosted by Atlas Corps, which is essentially a leadership development journey program that you can sign up for as part of the Banyan Impact Fellowship. Here is a testimonial from an alum, Erin. She was serving in Rajasthan in Jaipur with an organization called EcoRap. During her fellowship, she worked with rural women in the community in recycling waste materials to build products and ensure sustainable means of livelihood through micro enterprise opportunities. According to Erin, the Banyan Impact Fellowship played an instrumental part in her personal and professional growth. She felt what sets this fellowship program apart is the potential for language study, opportunities for field visits, as well as mentorship from experienced senior fellows who have lived experience in the social development field in India. Here's a testimonial from Maitreyi. Maitreyi is a 2018-19 Banyan Impact Fellow, and her project was focused on education and in making education more engaging and fun for public school students in Gujarat. I'm going to take a quick 30-second pause so you could read Maitreyi's testimonial. Now, I will talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria. Our applications for the 2025-26 cohort is open now. And the eligibility criteria is you need to be a US citizen or permanent resident or an Indian citizen to be able to apply for the Banyan Impact Fellowship. You need to be between 21 and 35 years of age. You need to have a bachelor's degree or other undergraduate degree by the time you apply for the fellowship. You need to have a clear commitment to positive and sustainable change and US India bridge building. Here's an overview of the application process. So the application process itself involves two stages. The first one is a written application where all the candidates submit an application for the Banyan Impact Fellowship. The shortlisted candidates from that will be taken to interview round. So the two stages of the application would be the written essays and the interview process. Post the application round, you will be matched with a host organization for interviews. So you can choose up to 3 organizations for interactions at the matching stage. Once your matching is successful and you receive an offer to be part of the Banyan Impact Fellowship, you are part of the fellowship program and your training begins. So this training happens at the beginning of the fellowship, midpoint, and endpoint. Besides that, there is ongoing training throughout the year, and you have support structures in the form of senior fellows and program staff. Finally, in terms of knowledge, you get not only to interact with the alumni of BIF, but also exposure to the work that American India Foundation does across education, health, livelihoods, and leadership development in India. Once you are offered a Banyan Impact Fellow offer, here's how the fellowship timeline looks. It starts with the orientation in September, followed by a thematic conference in February, and a concluding public seminar in June. Awesome. Thank you so much for patiently listening to the information session. With that, I would like to sort of invite Ben again into the conversation. Like I mentioned at the beginning, Ben was a 2023-24 fellow, and we are very pleased that he could make time today to share his fellowship experience with us. Ben, can I request you to briefly introduce yourself? Also share a little bit of a brief overview of the placement city, host organization, and the project that you worked on during your fellowship.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to start out by giving my background before I started the fellowship, because I think that could be helpful for some people thinking about the fellowship. So I went to Colorado College, to a liberal arts college, small college in Colorado. and I actually studied history there. And then I worked for a year at a legal aid organization in the United States before starting the fellowship. My fellowship placement, I was placed in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, and I was at the Vikram Sarabhai Center for Development Interaction, also known as VICSIT. Uh, that organization mostly works on sustainable development and livelihoods, especially working with people's institutions or small groups of women and other entrepreneurs in the community to try to increase their incomes in a sustainable manner. The focus of my project was mostly on the documentation side of things for Vixit. So I worked on a number of different projects. One thing I worked extensively on was the annual report for Vixit. Also, because as I said earlier, I was a history major, I worked on a historical publication or a draft of a historical publication because Vixit was coming up on celebrating 50 years. And then I also worked on other documentation projects like an impact assessment.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ben. Um, I'm requesting everyone on the call to use the comment section to sort of key in your questions while we start the conversation with some frequently asked questions with Ben. Ben, can you talk about some of the key highlights of your fellowship?
Yeah. So to go through different areas in which the highlights come from, I was just going to start with a personal, more fun highlight. I think getting to travel a lot was a big highlight for me throughout the fellowship with the leave that was provided through the program. A specific trip I wanted to highlight, and actually one of the pictures up there is from that trip. Picture of me on a horse is from I went on a solo trip to Kashmir towards the end of my fellowship. There are a few members of our cohort who are from there. And in addition to getting to explore around there, I think a special moment for me was one of my friends from the cohort. I actually was able to have dinner with her family, even though she wasn't there. And I think that was sort of like a special personal moment for me during the fellowship. I think I wanted to highlight something in terms of the programming that AIF and the BIF team did during the fellowship. I think the midpoint conference was a real highlight for me. I think at that point I really knew everyone in my cohort pretty well, and also we had sort of started to get going on our projects. I think at orientation everybody sort of was thinking about what their project was. There was a element of uncertainty with the organization, the new cities that we were all moving to, but I think it was really great to meet everybody at midpoint and to sort of share stories and learn. And one thing that we did as part of our midpoint conference was we did site visits to other NGOs working in similar fields to similar projects that we were working on. And I think that really helped to clarify things for me and having conversations with my co-fellows about those site visits and about our projects. So that was a highlight from that. And then in terms of a highlight from my work at my host organization, Vixit, I think because I spent a lot of time on the annual report, I think when it was finally printed and published and I got to see the physical copy of that, that was just like a big highlight to see that, my work had gone somewhere and that there was sort of a tangible product from my work, because you don't always get that sort of satisfaction in seeing that and seeing that. And then another thing I want to highlight from my work at my host organization, for the historical publication and the impact assessment, I did a number of interviews. And I think one sticks out in my mind in particular. I was doing an interview with members or leaders from women's self-help groups in northern Gujarat. And sort of in that, they sort of talked about the impact of the self-help group and the support from Vixit in their lives. And I think that moment was where some of the work that Vixit did and the real life impact of that sort of crystallized for me and understanding that. And what particularly sticks out about that is those SHG leaders had been in meetings all day. And it was towards the end of the day. And I was like, if you don't want to, like, we can find another time to do this interview. But they insisted, like, we really want to talk to you because we want you to know, like, sort of our experience, and we want to sort of like move that forward as part of my support of the documentation efforts. So that was sort of a meaningful experience for me.
Yes, Thank you so much for sharing some of these wonderful experiences, Ben, and also sharing some of these pictures from your fellowship journey. Um, I think another question that I had is going to sort of probably take you back in time, thinking about the matching process itself. Could you talk to us a little bit about how the matching process was during your fellowship selection, and how you worked with the host organization to scope out your work?
Yeah. So after I did my interview with AIF and I became a finalist for the fellowship, I did a number of interviews. I actually was not able to match in my first round of interviews. So the four, I think at the time it was four organizations that I preferenced. I did interviews with all four organizations and I didn't match, but I was given a second opportunity and I interviewed with three more organizations as part of my matching process. And it admittedly, like, it was a stressful process, a longer process at the time, but I do truly believe that I ended up getting paired with the absolute right organization for me. And when I met my co-fellows who were placed at some of the organizations that I had previously interviewed with, I sort of understood, like, yes, this person is much better for that position than I am. And I think that the BIF team, as well as the host organizations, are really thoughtful about, not only what skills do each of the fellows have, but what are the host organizations looking for, and in what ways sort of the placement can allow each fellow to grow. And so that's what I want to emphasize about that is just sort of the intentionality of the process of putting people in a good circumstance. In terms of scoping out my project, I think my host organization was really good about fitting my project to my skills, and sort of finding things within the organization that fit their needs. I think one example of that, as I said earlier, I was a history major and I worked on a historical publication for them. In the initial description of the placement, that hadn't been in the sort of description, but that sort of came out of them looking at my background and what I was bringing to the table. And it was their idea to use those skills that I had and to do something that they were interested in. So I think that was big. And then as the process unfolded, I think the bigger thing was just continually checking in with my supervisors and the AIF team about the scope of the project, because I think at some points earlier in the project, I was a bit overly ambitious in what I thought I was going to be able to get done. And then just being realistic and sort of working and being flexible throughout that, because there are also a number of things I ended up working on that I didn't hadn't occurred to me that I could help with and whatnot. So it's just sort of a communication thing.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think for people who sort of don't understand how matching works and how one sort of works with the host organization and scoping the work, this sort of gives a peek into how the whole process flows, at least from a fellow's experience. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think my next question was, can you talk to us through your experience of living in India? How was it, visiting India for the fellowship and the 10 months living in India, your experience living in India?
Yeah, I mean, overall, it was a really great experience. I had never been to India before I started the fellowship, so I know obviously there were some Indian fellows as part of my cohort, and even some of the American fellows had been. So obviously, it was a bit of a daunting thing to move across the world for 10 months to a place that I had never been. But I think the thing that really struck me was sort of how welcoming everybody was, not only in the cohort and at the host organization, but just in the surrounding community in Ahmedabad where I was living, sort of in the neighborhood, getting to know some of the people who own the stores or worked at the stores near me and finding that community in those places. I had never lived in a major city before, so that was a major adjustment for me. For some people in the cohort or some of you, it may be the opposite. I know one of the fellows from my cohort was from New York and had went to college in New York as well, and he was placed in a village. So he sort of had the opposite direction of adjustment. So any number of things like that can happen, but I found it to be a great experience and that people were welcoming. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Could you also talk a little bit about how was it coping with a different language and a culture? Because Gujarat is different from, let's say, Delhi in India, and how did you sort of cope with that, and how did you find your own community?
Yeah, yeah, in terms of the language part of that first, I think one thing that AIF did really well was to provide language training for us. So I took Hindi classes for the first part of my fellowship, and that really helped me sort of in that adjustment. And then in terms of the cultural adjustment aspect, I think I really tried to approach from the mindset of being open and saying yes to things and participating in as many things as I could, and it was by doing that and meeting people through participating that I was able, to sort of find community. One community that ended up being important for me is actually just the people that I lived with. So I lived in the hostel on the campus of the organization that I was working at, and so those people were a great support system, and we ended up becoming good friends and, like, are still in touch even now that I'm back in the US, so that's sort of how I approached it, but of course, that language barrier is always gonna be something that you're gonna have to navigate, and it's not gonna be easy at all times, but I think people, being willing and using Google Translate when you have to, I think that's gonna always be your friend.
Thank you for sharing that. I think Google Translate is definitely going to come in handy. You spoke a little bit about the housing and you stayed in the hostel, with the host organization. Could you share a little bit more about the sort of support you received with respect to housing, how you went about it? Because oftentimes, when people from US move to India, this is a question that, most of our candidates ask. So if you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so obviously the fellowship started with the orientation. So we started in Delhi, and then for the first 15 days that we went to our host sites, so for me, Ahmedabad, my housing was provided by AIF. My housing was paid for and funded by AIF and provided by my host organization. So my host organization, or sorry, no, the host organization has to, as part of their contract, if I'm correct on this, um, pay for the first 2 weeks of housing. So that was completely taken care of. They had a place lined up. I actually was staying at a hotel for 15 days. And then that gives you time to find housing later in the fellowship. Yeah, I worked with my host organization to look at various housing options, what would work best for me. And then I ended up deciding on the hostel just because it was so convenient and it worked for me. I think that, how different people are going to have different housing needs. Just like a note on that, there were people in my cohort who were also in Ahmedabad and worked on the same campus as me, who for those first 15 days had stayed in the hostel, and they made the decision and were able to find apartments outside, and they were glad that they made that decision, and that was the right decision for me. For me, I ended up choosing the hostel, and I was glad that that was the decision I made. So it's just, knowing what your priorities are and what you're looking for. But that first 15 days of support that's part of the host organization's responsibility was sort of crucial in that process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. I think the next question is about a key challenge during your fellowship or challenges. If you could talk us through your key challenge during your fellowship, that would be great.
Yeah. I think one of the key challenges, we sort of touched on this, but was the language and like talking more specifically about my project. So, like I said, I took Hindi classes, but a lot of the communities that my host organization worked with in their field office, they only spoke Gujarati and didn't speak Hindi. So I had to rely on translation from my host organization, and even in Hindi, my Hindi wasn't the best. It was very minimally passable at best. But sort of, I think one challenge was navigating that translation because I think, especially when you're relying on uh, translation, people who already know the answers to some of the questions you're asking, some of that may be confusing about why you have that doubt or that concern. And also, sort of like trying to convey the intention of what the person was trying to say. So navigating that, especially in terms of collection of data, that was something that I sort of had to work through. I think more so one of the ways I succeeded better with that was sitting down with the people I was working with and talking them through my intention, for example, in the, say, focus group discussion questions that I wrote, and saying, this is why I wrote this question. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, that wording that you like, the literal translation of that wording is not working. Let's try this other approach and like to work from there. So I think that was one of the bigger, challenges.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. I think I could completely relate to what you were saying, even though I wasn't a fellow, Banyan Impact fellow. Language could be like huge challenge in India. I can't fluently speak Hindi too. I come from south of India where we speak Tamil, so I was just laughing as you were saying those because I could completely relate to what you're saying. So thank you for sharing that. I think I'm sort of wrapping up some of the frequently asked questions with Ben. Before I ask my last question to Ben, a quick reminder to post any questions that you have on the comment section so we could get started with answering your questions. We also understand that this is the second live that we are doing, whilst it's the first for this 2025. Oftentimes our viewers watch the first live and have looked through our website. So it's absolutely fine. Even if you have a simple question, please do post that. Happy to take that. Great. So Ben, coming back to you, my next question to you is, I know you're a recent alumni. You've like literally a few months ago graduated. So, what are you thinking about what next, and how do you think the fellowship is sort of shaping your thinking around that?
Yeah, the fellowship has been honestly very helpful in clarifying my future plans and setting me up for that. So, like I said at the beginning, Vixit works on livelihoods initiatives, and that's a key thing that a lot of development organizations in India work on. I think that's not a framework that's commonly used in the US in the nonprofit sector. And so, thinking about that and how to increase people's income, I think that really sort of shaped sort of my passion and my direction and what I want to do in my future. So for me, in thinking about that, labor unions and other efforts to increase money for people who don't have enough money in the United States sort of connects directly to that work. And so, sort of actually, by stepping away from the legal sector, it gave me more sort of confidence or clarity that that's what I wanted to do to be an employment lawyer or a labor lawyer. So, immediately after the fellowship, I came back and started studying for the law school admissions test. So, I took that a few months ago, and then I completed my applications for law school. So I have those all completed, and now I'm working at the Marion County Public Defender's Office in Indianapolis, Indiana, sort of near where I live. So I'm going to work that job until I start law school next fall. So it really sort of set me up and gave me that perspective and clarity in what I wanted to do. So yeah.
Yeah, good luck with your applications and fingers crossed. Very excited to hear this journey of yours. We will always be rooting for you, in whichever career pathway, you choose to sort of contribute or serve. So good luck. I think Maya has a question. Maya asks, Ben, can you please describe what a typical day looked like for you during the fellowship?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess I can start with just like a work day. So, my office worked actually from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. So I lived on the campus, so I would have breakfast on campus, and then I would basically just walk up the hill to my office. Oftentimes I would go home for lunch because it was right there. So I either we would prepare something in the morning or I would make something then and there for lunch. But usually we would sort of prepare something, my roommates and I, and then I would have that for lunch and then working in the office for the afternoon. And then, yeah, and then coming home after work, I think sort of that varied a lot. So I did a lot of field visits as part of my as part of my project. So I spent multiple nights at the field office traveling. So at the field office, my day-to-day life looks very different. So in Ahmedabad on a work day, I'm pretty much in the office most of the day. In the field office, mostly going around meeting with farmers and community members that my organization was working with, the uh, talking to the field staff members to hear about how their projects are going and sort of getting that insight because that was the majority of where the work was happening. And my organization, it's different from organization to organization, but my organization worked some Saturdays, but not all Saturdays. So I was essentially alternating 5 and 6 day weeks at work. And that was sort of the day-to-day work life. Then cooking dinner with my roommates and sort of starting all over again.
Thank you for sharing that, Ben. Maya asks another question. Hari, could you give some other example of host organizations that past fellows have been matched with, and particularly in public health sector? Maya, that's a great question. I'm going to give you an example that's on top of my mind, but please do drop me a mail. I'll share my mail ID by end of this call, where I could share more examples of such. Currently, one of our fellows from US is working with Public Health Research Institute of India, based out of Mysuru. So that's a public health project to develop educational materials detailing the HPV vaccines benefits and efficacy in cervical cancer prevention, specifically for rural and low health literate communities. So that's one project. There's also Courtney, who's a current fellow who is hosted by Team Lease Foundation, who works in rural Odisha on a public health project to compile data and notes that represent the efficacy of Team Lease's integrated program on child health and nutrition, and disseminate to relevant stakeholders in the sector. So these are two projects that come to my mind, but happy to share more. Please do drop me a note. The next question is, Ben, what was your motivation for applying for this fellowship?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and probably something I should have addressed earlier. So, in my undergraduate work as part of my thesis, a lot of my research and work had been on British colonialism in India, specifically in relation to laws in British colonial India. So I think that's sort of, and I had taken other Indian history classes while I was in college. So I think that's sort of what had uh, I guess, gotten me more fascinated in working in India, and sort of wanting to learn from personal experience because you can read about a place or you can read about a place in the past, but you're going to learn so much more by being there. And I think it's also, I thought, working in the American development sector, um, going to probably the other country that's going to be a major player, no matter what you do in that binational corridor between India and the United States. I thought, there's always things you can learn by stepping out of the place where you're from. And I found that to be true, sort of as I was talking about personally, in terms of the approach to making a difference, where I think the Indian development sector is way ahead of the American development sector. So yeah, that was my motivation behind going.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Ben. There's another question from Saurabh Kumar, again to you. What are some of the opportunities or processes that helped you in self-transformation during your fellowship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of self-transformation, for me, it took a lot of assessing where I was struggling and how I could get better at that. I think one thing that I initially struggled with was the workflow in the office that I was working in. I think just in terms of a lot more happened by face-to-face conversation and phone calls as opposed to email and written communication, which was a big change from the office I had been working in the US. And so I identified that, and I won't say I was great at that by the end of my fellowship, but something I sort of learned or identified was like I need to be more assertive in like having these conversations and figuring out how to navigate work in this environment because I'm not getting as much done as I can. I'm not helping people on their projects as much as I can. So I sort of identifying that and then trying to work on it. I think there were times where I would get better and then I would get less assertive and then identifying that again and working on it. So that was sort of mostly how I focused on that, is being flexible with yourself, knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, and trying to work on them.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. I think that brings us to the end of all questions on the comments section. Probably we'll give it 30 more seconds to see if there are any last minute questions that's coming up. Yeah, Maya asks, Ben, do you have any advice for the written and or interview part of the application process? Essentially, any tips or advice for the application process?
Sure. Yeah, I think what I would think very specifically about why you want to do this fellowship, not just from the perspective of personal development, but also how that fits into your career and what you're hoping to get out of that experience. I think thinking very directly about that, and then think very directly if you're coming from the United States about why India, like, there are plenty of other fellowships or programs you can apply for, like, why India? Why the AIF fellowship? What is it doing? What will it allow you to do that other organizations and other projects are not doing? And that's, like, to return to earlier questions about my motivation for applying for the fellowship, like, that's why I applied for the AIF fellowship, is because I felt like it was doing things that other fellowships didn't do or that I wasn't be able to get. I think one thing I want to note, that was a motivating factor and actually was one of the biggest positives, was the binational cohort that I had as part of my fellowship. I think having those connections, talking to, you know, having that cultural exchange and that community of people who are going through a similar thing was really helpful, not only for my project, but just personally in developing those friendships. And there are people as part of my cohort who I'll probably be in touch with for a long time. So that was a meaningful thing with that sort of structure provided by orientation, midpoint, and endpoint. I even traveled with some of the other fellows during the fellowship. So yeah, those are some of the things that I would think about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. I think you beautifully summarized, one of the things that we definitely look for in the application process is your motivation. Why you, why now, and why this fellowship, right? So please do ensure in the application process you're being very, clear about communicating your motivation. Thank you for sharing that. I think that brings us to the end of this information session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can always reach out to us, Ben and I, with any questions on the email address. Um, you will see the email address on the screen now. So, Ben, and please make a note of Ben and my mail IDs. If you have any questions, write to us. More than happy to, write back to you. And thank you so much, Ben, and really good luck for your applications and grad school. Thank you so much for sharing key aspects of your fellowship, key challenges, and patiently answering all the questions. Some of the prospective applicants asked on the comments. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Hari.